The year is 1362. The air above the wild fields of Ukraine is vibrating. It is a low, terrifying thrum that you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. It is the sound of 30,000 hooves pounding the dry earth. To the south, a black ocean of warriors floods the horizon, blotting out the sun. This is the Golden Horde, the apex predator of the medieval world, the unstoppable machine that turned the great cities of Russia into graveyards and forced kings to crawl in the dirt for survival. Facing them is a smaller, silent line of men from the northern forests. They do not bang drums. They do not scream insults. They stand like statues of iron in the blistering heat. At their center sits a man who refuses to drink wine to numb the terror. Grand Duke Algirdas does not look like a king about to be slaughtered. He looks like a wolf staring at a wounded bull. History tells us that the Mongols were invincible. It tells us that Europe lived in fear of the Tatar Yoke for centuries. But history is often written by those who were too afraid to fight. Today, on the banks of the Blue Waters, that fear is about to die. Today, the forgotten empire of the North has come not to negotiate, but to hunt the hunters. This is the story of how a pagan army did the impossible. This is the Battle of Blue Waters. To understand why a forest army dared to challenge the masters of the world, we must first look at the monster itself. The Golden Horde was not just a kingdom, it was a force of nature. For over 100 years, it stretched from the Danube River in the west to the deep freeze of Siberia in the east. Its shadow covered the Russian principalities, enforcing a system of dominance so complete that princes were forced to travel to the Khan's court, bow their heads to the ground, and beg for the Yarlik, the patent to rule their own people. It was a machine built on fear. The Horde was the wealthiest, most militarily advanced state in the region. Their horse archers could kill at 300 yards. Their tactical flexibility allowed them to encircle and annihilate slow-moving European armies with terrifying ease. But by 1362, if you zoomed in closer to the encampments near the mouth of the Dnieper River, you would see the cracks in the armor. The Golden Horde was dying of a self-inflicted disease. Historians call this period the Magna Turbasio, the Great Troubles. It is a 20-year nightmare of succession crises that turned the ruling family into a viper's nest. Since 1357, the throne of the Horde had changed hands more times than the seasons. Khans were not dying of old age. They were dying of poison in their wine, daggers in the dark, and silk strangulation cords. In just 2 decades, nearly 24 claimants had seized power, only to be murdered by the next ambitious relative. The central nervous system of the empire had been severed. This political hemorrhage had disastrous consequences for the periphery. With the capital in Sarai consumed by civil war, the western territories, the lands bordering Lithuania and Poland, effectively went rogue. They were ruled not by a single unified Great Khan, but by warlords acting as kings. Enter the 3 men who stand in Algirdas's path: Kutlug Bey, Hajib Bey, and Dmitri. These 3 Tatar lords controlled the vast Podolia and the steppes north of the Black Sea. In any other era, they would be terrifying unifiers. Kutlug Bey acted as the senior commander, a man accustomed to the absolute obedience of his tumans. Hajib and Dmitri commanded their own hordes, holding the flanks. But in 1362, they were rivals first and allies second. They looked at each other with as much suspicion as they looked at the enemy. They squabbled over tax collection rights in the Slavic villages. They fought over grazing lands. They retained their armies to protect themselves from Sarai as much as from external threats. This division bred a fatal arrogance. To them, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a nuisance, not an existential threat. They viewed the Lithuanians as forest bandits, dangerous in the swamps perhaps, but suicidal if they dared to step onto the open grass. The idea that a heavy cavalry force from the north could outmaneuver the masters of the steppe seemed laughable to them. The Mongols had defeated the Teutonic Knights at Legnica. They had crushed the Hungarians at Mohi. They possessed the composite bow and the legacy of Genghis Khan. So when scouts reported dust clouds moving south from Kiev, the Khans did not panic. They saw an opportunity for plunder. They believed Algirdas was walking into a trap. They imagined the Lithuanians would march in a clumsy, feudal column, ripe for the slaughter. They did not realize that the rot within their own empire had blinded them to the new reality. The wolf was at the door, and the shepherds were too busy fighting each other to notice. To understand the army marching south to meet the Golden Horde, you have to discard the traditional image of a medieval crusade. The men following Algirdas were not fighting for the cross. They were the last holdouts of the old gods in Europe. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was an island of paganism in a sea of aggressive monotheism. To their west, the Teutonic Knights burned villages in the name of Christ. To their east, the Golden Horde demanded submission in the name of the Khan. By all logic, Lithuania should have been crushed between these two millstones long ago. But they survived because they mastered a weapon more potent than the sword: adaptability. Algirdas led a force that was a terrifying hybrid of east and west. At its core were the Lithuanian elite warriors who worshipped Perkunas, the thunder god. They rode heavy war horses like Western knights, clad in mail and plate, but they fought with the ferocity and ambush tactics of forest tribes. They were heavy enough to smash a battle line, but light enough to vanish into the tree line. However, the real genius of the Grand Duchy lay not in how they fought, but in how they ruled. As Algirdas pushed into the Slavic lands of what is now Ukraine, he did not come as a conqueror forcing a new culture upon the locals. He came with a brilliant, simple promise: the status quo. The Lithuanians operated under a famous maxim: we introduce no new customs and change no old ones. Think about how revolutionary that was for the 14th century. The Teutonic Knights wanted to Germanize and convert you. The Mongols wanted to tax you into starvation and enslave your children. But Algirdas told the Orthodox princes of Ruthenia, keep your religion, keep your laws, keep your language. Just pay your taxes to Vilnius instead of Sarai, and we will protect you with our swords. It was a masterstroke of political engineering. It transformed the invasion into a liberation. As the Lithuanian army moved through the Ruthenian lands towards the Blue Waters, they were not bogged down by partisan warfare or local insurgencies. Instead, they gathered strength. Local Slavic regiments, eager to throw off the Tatar yoke, joined Algirdas's ranks. The army swelled, becoming a coalition of the willing. You had pagan Lithuanians riding shoulder to shoulder with Orthodox Rus soldiers. They were united not by a god, but by a common enemy. And at the head of this diverse machine sat a man who was an enigma to his contemporaries. Algirdas was not a typical European king. While other monarchs held lavish banquets and drowned their fears in wine, Algirdas was famously sober. He refused the cup. He stared into the flames with a terrifying intensity, guarding his strategy so closely that he snapped at anyone who asked for the plan. He famously growled, "If my beard knew what I was thinking, I would rip it out right now." This obsession with secrecy was the only reason his army was still alive. He had marched hundreds of miles into the belly of the Mongol Empire undetected. He did not play by the rules of chivalry. He played to win. He saw what others missed. He mobilized his forces with a speed that defied medieval logistics. This was not a slow, lumbering crusade with baggage trains and camp followers. This was a lightning raid scaled up to the size of an invasion. The Wolf of the North had come to hunt, and he brought with him a pack that was hungry for vengeance. The prize waiting at the end of the spear was not just gold, or glory. It was a ghost. Kiev, once the glittering capital of the Rus's people, a metropolis that rivaled Paris and London, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Since the catastrophic Mongol siege of 1240, the city had languished under the Tatar yoke for over a century. It was no longer a center of power. It was a tributary outpost, a bleed valve for the Golden Horde to extract wealth from the Slavic lands. But Algirdas saw past the ruins. He saw the map. He understood that whoever controlled Kiev controlled the Dnieper River, and whoever controlled the Dnieper held the keys to the trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This was the Amber Road reimagined. If Lithuania could secure this corridor, they would bypass the hostile Poland to the west and the chaotic Moscow to the east. They would create a superhighway of commerce that flowed directly into their pockets. The economic motivation was just as sharp as the military one. The Grand Duke intended to cut the financial artery of the Golden Horde. The reality of the Tatar yoke here was brutal and bureaucratic. It was a constant state of extortion. The Mongols installed officials known as baskoks, tax collectors backed by armed guards. These men were the hated symbols of oppression. They counted every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, and every able-bodied son. 10% of everything went to the horde. If you could not pay in silver, you paid in skin. The tithe of blood, the taking of slaves to be sold in the markets of Crimea, was the terrifying cost of doing business with the Khan. Algirdas's campaign was a surgical strike against this system. As his army secured the towns north of the wild fields, they did something simple but revolutionary. They kicked out the baskoks. They stopped the flow of silver to the steppe. Imagine the shockwave this sent through the Mongol command structure. For decades, the warlords Kutlug, Hajib, and Dmitri had treated these lands as their personal bank accounts. They relied on this tribute to pay their soldiers and maintain their power base during the civil war. Suddenly, the money stopped. The grain stopped. The slaves stopped. Algirdas had effectively placed a siege on their wallets, but this was a high-stakes gamble. By marching into the wild fields, the vast, open grasslands where the terrain itself was an enemy, he was leaving the safety of the forests behind. The tall grass hid Tatar scouts. The open sky offered no cover from the eyes of the enemy. Every mile they marched south brought them closer to an inevitable collision. Algirdas was betting his entire kingdom on a single premise: that he could strike the blow before the sleeping giants of the steppe fully woke up. He was not just fighting for territory, he was fighting to shift the geopolitical axis of the entire continent. Standing in the path of the Lithuanian advance were three men who embodied the fracturing power of the Golden Horde: Kutlug Bey, Hajib Bey, and Dmitri. In the eyes of their people, they were the lords of the western steppe, rulers of vast fiefdoms carved out of the chaos of the civil war. Kutlug Bey, the senior commander, was a man of the old school, hardened by decades of raiding, accustomed to the absolute obedience of his two-mens. Hajib and Dmitri, commanding the flanks, were younger, hungrier, and dangerous in their own right. But in the summer of 1362, these three warlords were rivals first and allies a distant second. They looked at each other with as much suspicion as they looked at the enemy. For years, they had squabbled over tax collection rights in the Slavic villages. They had fought over prime grazing lands for their horses. They retained their armies not just to expand the empire, but to protect themselves from the poisonous politics of the capital, Sarai. This internal division bred a fatal arrogance. To them, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a nuisance, a pest from the swamps, not an existential threat. They viewed the Lithuanians as forest bandits, dangerous in the thickets perhaps, but suicidal if they dared to step onto the open grass. The idea that a heavy cavalry force from the north could outmaneuver the masters of the steppe seemed laughable. The Mongols had a long memory. They remembered defeating the Teutonic Knights at Legnica. They remembered crushing the Hungarians at Mohi. They possessed the composite bow, a weapon that could kill at 300 yards, and the tactical flexibility to encircle and annihilate slow-moving European armies. So when scouts reported dust clouds moving south from Kiev, the Khans did not panic. They saw an opportunity for easy plunder. They believed Algirdas was walking into a trap of his own making. They imagined the Lithuanians would march in a clumsy, feudal column, ripe for the slaughter. They expected to employ the feigned retreat, the classic maneuver where they rode away, drew the heavy knights out of formation, and then turned to shower them with arrows until they looked like porcupines. The Khans were fighting the last war, relying on the terrifying reputation of their ancestors rather than the reality on the ground. They failed to notice that Algirdas was not bringing a traditional feudal army. He was not bringing a crusade. While Kutlug, Hajib, and Dmitri casually assembled their forces near the Blue Waters, treating the upcoming battle as a routine punitive expedition, they missed the critical signal. The enemy had moved too fast. Algirdas had bypassed the outer settlements that usually provided early warning. He had denied them the time to gather the full might of the steppe. The three warlords gathered their tumens at the river convergence, a massive sea of horses, yurts, and banners. It looked impressive. It looked invincible. But it was a fragile coalition held together by pride, about to face a unified, singular will. The battlefield chosen by the Grand Duke was not random. It was a masterpiece of tactical foresight. The location was the confluence of the Snezhnouka and southern Bug rivers, a place history remembers simply as the Blue Waters. Algirdas arrived first. He did not just occupy the ground, he shaped it to his will. He knew that the Mongol way of war was built on a single, terrifying shape, the circle. They did not charge head-on. They spread their wings, utilizing superior speed to wrap around the enemy's flanks, surrounding them in a shrinking ring of arrows until the trapped army collapsed from panic and exhaustion. Algirdas understood this geometry of death perfectly. He knew that if he met the Khans on the open, flat grass, his army would be encircled and annihilated within hours. He needed walls. But on the vast Ukrainian steppe, there were no stone castles. So he used the water. By anchoring his flanks against the riverbanks and dense natural obstacles of the Snezhnouka, he forced the Mongols into a funnel. He denied them the infinite space they needed to perform their deadly caracole, the rotating circle of mounted archers. If they wanted to fight him, they would have to come straight at him. But the Grand Duke went further. He reinvented the standard European battle line. Most medieval armies of this era fought in a single solid block or a long, thin line. Algirdas broke his army into 6 distinct, self-contained regiments. He arranged them in a deep concave formation, a half-moon shape facing the enemy. This was a masterstroke of medieval warfare. Why a half-moon? Because it created a natural kill zone in the center. If the Mongols charged the middle, the Lithuanian wings could close in, turning the enemy's favorite tactic of encirclement against them. Furthermore, by separating his army into independent units, Algirdas ensured that panic could not spread like a contagion. If one unit took heavy fire, the others remained steady. The composition of these units was equally specific and designed for a singular purpose: absorption and counterattack. The front ranks were filled with the heavy infantry and dismounted knights of the Rus lands. These men were the anvil. They carried tall pavis shields and heavy mail designed to absorb the kinetic energy of Mongol arrows. They were the wall that refused to break. Behind them, hidden from the immediate view of the enemy or waiting on the edges, sat the elite Lithuanian heavy cavalry, the hammer. For the Mongol horse archers staring across the field, This presented a frustrating puzzle. Their bows, while deadly, had limitations. To penetrate heavy European plate and chainmail, they needed to be close, dangerously close. Usually, they would ride in, loose a volley, and ride away before the enemy could retaliate. But here, the terrain restricted their movement. The river squeezed them. The Concave Formation refused to scatter. Algirdas had effectively transformed the open steppe into a corridor fight. He had stripped the Golden Horde of their greatest assets, speed and maneuverability. He was forcing the three Khans to play a game of brute force, a game where Lithuanian steel was heavier than Tatar arrows. The atmosphere in the Lithuanian ranks was one of suffocating tension. The men knew that once the arrows started flying, they must stand their ground. To take a step back was to invite slaughter. To charge prematurely was suicide. They had to trust in the geometry their Grand Duke had drawn in the dust. They had to trust that the Wolf of the North had calculated the angles correctly, because if he was wrong, the blue waters would run red before sunset. The battle began not with a roar, but with a whistle. It was a sound that had haunted the nightmares of Europe for 3 generations, the collective shriek of thousands of composite bows releasing at once. The sky above the blue waters darkened as the first volley arced over the steppe. For a soldier in the Lithuanian front line, this was the moment of truth. You crouched behind your shield, listening to the terrifying rhythm of the impact. Thud, thud, clang. The arrows of the Golden Horde were designed to pierce mail and flesh. They struck with the force of a hammer, but today they were meeting resistance. The heavy paves shields of the Rus infantry and the plate armor of the Lithuanian elite were holding. Kutlug Bey and the other Khans watched from their command hill, expecting the usual result. They expected the enemy line to waver. They expected gaps to open up as men fell screaming. But the line held. The last pagans did not panic. When a man fell, another stepped forward to fill the void, silent and grim. Seeing that the long-range bombardment wasn't shattering the formation, the Khans ordered the next phase of Mongol tactics, the Tulugma, or the standard sweep. Waves of horse archers rode furiously toward the Lithuanian lines, loosing arrows at point-blank range. Screaming war cries meant to curdle the blood. They brought with them the cacophony of the nomadic war camp, the beating of kettle drums, the shrill whistles of commanders, and the chaotic shouting of men from a dozen different tribes. It was a spectacle designed to terrify. They wanted the enemy to see the sheer scale of the horde, to feel the hopelessness of the arithmetic. But when the Khans looked across the river valley, they did not see an army trembling in fear. They did not see a wagon fort, the traditional defensive circle Europeans used to hide from horse archers. They saw lines. Grand Duke Algirdas had arranged his forces in a formation that defied the logic of steppe warfare. His army stood in absolute silence. The sunlight glinted off the heavy plate armor of the Lithuanian elite and the polished shields of the Rus infantry. There were no taunts. There was no movement, just a wall of steel waiting in the heat. For the Mongol commanders, this static discipline was confusing, perhaps even insulting. In their experience, European armies were clumsy beasts that charged blindly or cowered behind walls. But Algirdas was doing neither. He was inviting them in. This visual standoff revealed the soul of the two armies. On the southern bank, you had the Golden Horde in its twilight years. Loud, numerically superior, but internally fractured. The three Khans rode under different banners, their men segregated by clan loyalty. They were united only by greed and the desire to crush this upstart. On the northern bank, you had the Grand Duchy, outnumbered, but forged into a singular instrument of will. Algirdas rode the line, his face impassive. He knew the psychology of his enemy better than they knew themselves. He knew that the Khans, arrogant in their numbers, would fight aggressively. They would not be cautious. They would want to end this quickly, collect the loot, and get back to their internal power struggles. And that impatience was exactly what the wolf was counting on. And then, just as the wave of horsemen seemed about to crash into the spears, they suddenly wheeled away. This was the moment. The trap. The Mongol riders turned their backs, screaming in mock terror, their formation loosening as if they were routing. This was the feigned retreat, the deadliest maneuver in the history of steppe warfare. It was the same trick that had destroyed the knights of Hungary and Poland. It played on the deepest instincts of a soldier, the desire to kill a fleeing enemy. For a medieval knight, seeing the backs of his enemies was an irresistible invitation. The adrenaline screamed, "They are running! Now is our chance! Charge!" If the Lithuanians broke their line to chase the fleeing Tatars, even for a moment, the trap would spring. The fleeing Mongols would suddenly turn in their saddles, utilizing the Parthian shot to butcher the disorganized pursuers. The shield wall would dissolve, and the massacre would begin. But Algirdas had drilled his men for this exact second. He rode behind the lines, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Stoveti, stand." He knew that the retreat was a lie. He knew that if even one regiment broke ranks, the integrity of his half-moon would collapse. Imagine the discipline required in that heat. You are being shot at. Your blood is up. Your instinct screams at you to charge the men who just killed your friends. But you must stand still. You must take the punishment and do absolutely nothing. It was a psychological torture test, and the coalition army passed it. Now, shift your perspective. Look at this through the eyes of a Mongol horseman. For his entire life, warfare had followed a script. You shoot, the enemy breaks, you chase, you win. It was a rhythm as natural as breathing. But today, the script was broken. You ride up to these forest barbarians, you scream, you shoot, you pretend to run away. And they just look at you. They stand like statues of iron. They don't chase you. They don't scatter. They don't make the mistake you need them to make. Confusion began to ripple through the Mongol ranks. The horses were foaming with sweat. The quivers, which had started the day full, were getting dangerously light. The Khans were becoming frustrated. Their entire way of war was predicated on the enemy's cooperation, on the enemy acting irrationally. But Algirdas refused to be irrational. The battle dragged on for hours, turning into a grueling stalemate. The Mongols were expending massive amounts of kinetic energy for little gain. The psychological weight of the battle began to shift. The hunter became unsure. The prey looked less like prey and more like a predator waiting to pounce. Algirdas watched the sun dipping in the sky. He saw the subtle changes in the enemy's movement. The Mongol charges were becoming ragged, less coordinated. The three Khans, perhaps arguing amongst themselves about why the stupid Europeans wouldn't fight properly, were losing control of the tempo. This was the breaking of the code. Algirdas had proven that the Golden Horde was a one-trick pony. If you denied them the open field, and if you denied them the panic they fed on, they didn't have a plan B. The deadly dance of the steppe had been stopped cold by a wall of northern discipline. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the steppe. The battlefield at Blue Waters was littered with broken arrows and exhausted horses. The Golden Horde had thrown everything they had at the Lithuanian line. Feints, volleys, screams, threats, and nothing had worked. The Mongol warriors were tired, frustrated, and crucially, their quivers were almost empty. Algirdas sat high in his saddle, watching the rhythm of the enemy slow down. He saw the Khans hesitating, arguing among themselves on the distant hill. Their attacks had lost their bite. The deadly swarm had become a ragged mob. The moment had arrived. The Grand Duke raised his mace. Horns blasted across the Lithuanian line. A deep, guttural sound, distinct from the high-pitched whistles of the steppe. The shield wall, which had stood like granite for hours, suddenly shifted. The Rus infantry stepped aside, opening gaps in the formation, like gates opening in a dam. And through those gates poured the thunder. The elite Lithuanian heavy cavalry had been waiting impatiently behind the infantry all day, their horses fresh, their lances leveled. Now they were unleashed. These were not nimble step ponies. These were massive European destriers bred for weight and impact, clad in mail barding. The knights riding them were encased in heavy plate. The Mongol horsemen, who just moments ago were casually riding close to the lines, hoping to provoke a reaction, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of charging steel. They tried to turn, to use their speed to escape, but they were too close. They were trapped by the geography of the riverbanks and their own packed numbers. The collision was catastrophic. It was not a graceful duel of swords. It was a brutal equation of physics. Mass times velocity. The heavy Lithuanian warhorses smashed into the lighter Mongol mounts, bowling them over like toys. Lance tips crunched through leather armor and silk tunics. The sheer kinetic energy of the charge shattered the front ranks of the horde instantly. For the Mongol warrior, this was a nightmare scenario. Their entire way of fighting depended on space, on keeping the enemy at arm's length. Now the enemy was right on top of them. In close quarters, their bows were useless. Their curved sabers bounced harmlessly off the thick Lithuanian plate armor. They were trapped in a crush of bodies, unable to maneuver, being hammered by maces and war axes. Panic, the weapon the Mongols had used so effectively against others for a century, now turned against them. The discipline of the horde evaporated. The Concave Formation of Algirdas acted like a pair of giant pincers. As the center charged, the wings closed in, squeezing the disorganized mass of Tatars tighter and tighter. The three Khans, Kutlug, Hajib, and Dmitri, watched in horror as their invincible Tumans dissolved into a terrified mob. The internal divisions of the Magna Turbasio resurfaced immediately. There was no coordinated defense, only a desperate scramble for survival. Each warlord looked to save his own skin. The coordinated deadly circle of the steppe had been broken by the straight, unyielding line of the north. The hunters had become the hunted, and in the chaos of that crush, the myth of Mongol invincibility began to bleed out into the waters of the Snezhnouka. The collapse of an empire does not happen silently. It sounds like a scream. As the Lithuanian heavy cavalry ground forward, the Golden Horde did not just retreat, they shattered. The three Khans, realizing the day was lost, made the decision that sealed the fate of their men. They did not rally the rearguard. They did not attempt a countercharge. They abandoned their armies. Kutlug, Hajib, and Dmitri turned their horses south toward the safety of the Crimea, leaving thousands of their loyal warriors to be cut down. This betrayal broke the last remnants of resistance. Seeing their leaders flee, the Mongol rank and file panicked. The cohesive unit that had terrified Europe for a century became a chaotic stampede. Men trampled each other in a desperate bid to escape the ironclad giants hacking through their lines. But Algirdas had chosen his battlefield well. The rivers that had protected his flanks now became the anvil for the slaughter. The Lithuanian pursuit was ruthless. They pushed the disorganized remnants of the horde back against the banks of the southern Bug and the Snezhnouka. Trapped between the cold water and the cold steel, the Mongols had no choice. Hundreds plunged into the river, their heavy leather armor dragging them down. The blue waters, named for their pristine clarity, began to darken. They churned with the desperate thrashing of dying men and horses, turning a muddy, frothing red. It was a massacre. The chroniclers tell us that the pursuit lasted for miles, a grim harvest of the steppe. The myth of the superior Mongol warrior, the demon on horseback who could not be killed, was dismantled body by body in the mud. By the time the sun finally set, the silence returned to the wild fields. But it was different now. It was not the tense silence of anticipation. It was the heavy, final silence of total victory. Algirdas stood on the riverbank, surveying the carnage. He had done the impossible. He had taken a gamble that could have erased his nation from history, and he had won. The bodies floating in the river were not just enemy soldiers. They were the symbols of a broken era. The Golden Horde was still vast, yes. It still controlled lands to the east. But the psychological spell was broken. The Tatar Yoke, that invisible chain of fear that bound the minds of Eastern Europe, had been snapped. The Wolf of the North had proven that the monster bled. And as the news of the slaughter at Blue Waters spread across the steppe, it carried a simple, terrifying message to every capital from Moscow to Constantinople. The balance of power has shifted. The North has risen. The aftermath of the Battle of Blue Waters was not just a military victory. It was a geopolitical landslide. As the dust settled on the banks of the Sinai Vodi, the myth of the Golden Horde lay shattered. The three Khans vanished into the steppes, their power broken, their reputations destroyed. They left behind not just their dead, but the keys to an entire civilization. Algirdas wasted no time. He understood momentum. He marched his victorious army straight to Kiev. Imagine the scene at the gates of the ancient capital. For over 100 years, since the catastrophic Mongol siege of 1240, Kiev had lived in fear. Its people had watched the horizon, dreading the dust clouds that signaled the arrival of the tax collectors. But today, the army approaching did not carry the horsetail banners of the Khan. They carried the Vitus, the White Knight of Lithuania. There was no siege. There was no starving out the defenders. The gates of Kiev swung open. The local princes and the Orthodox clergy welcomed Algirdas not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer. This validated his grand strategy of tolerance. By respecting the local religion and customs, he effectively walked into the most important city in Eastern Europe without shedding a drop of blood. He replaced the Mongol Baskaks with his own son, Vladimir, establishing a dynasty that blended Lithuanian strength with Ruthenian tradition. The Tatar yoke over the heart of Ukraine was snapped. The consequences of this moment rippled outward with terrifying speed. With Kiev secured, the dominoes fell. Podolia, Chernigov, and the vast tracts of the Dnieper basin pledged allegiance to Vilnius. Almost overnight, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania transformed. It ceased to be merely a Baltic forest state and became the largest nation in Europe. Look at the map after 1362. It is breathtaking. The Grand Duchy stretched from the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea in the north almost to the warm currents of the Black Sea in the south. It created a massive buffer zone, a shield that protected Central Europe from the chaos of the East. For the Golden Horde, the loss was catastrophic. The Magna Turbasio deepened. Deprived of the taxes and grain from the rich Slavic lands, the Khans turned on each other with even greater ferocity, fighting over the scraps of a shrinking empire. The Blue Waters' defeat exposed their weakness to the world. It signaled to other vassal states, most notably the rising Principality of Moscow, that the Mongol masters bled just like anyone else. If you open a standard history textbook, you will often read that the Tatar Yoke was broken by the Russian prince Dmitry Donskoy at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. That battle is legendary. It is celebrated in paintings, poems, and national holidays. But there is an uncomfortable truth hiding in the margins. Kulikovo happened 18 years after the Battle of Blue Waters. And while Kulikovo was a symbolic victory, the Mongols returned just 2 years later and burned Moscow to the ground. The yoke there didn't truly end for another century. In contrast, the victory at Blue Waters in 1362 was decisive. the Golden Horde never truly recovered their dominance over the Ukrainian lands. So why is this battle a footnote? Why is the genius of Algirdas largely forgotten by the wider world? The answer lies in who held the pen. For centuries, the narrative of Eastern European history was dominated by the rise of Moscow and later the Russian Empire. The story of a powerful, pagan, multi-ethnic Lithuanian state that liberated Kiev didn't fit the narrative of gathering the Russian lands. Later, Soviet historiography downplayed the distinct history of the Grand Duchy to emphasize a unified Slavic struggle. The Battle of Blue Waters became a ghost, an inconvenience to the official version of history. But today, we look at the map with fresh eyes. We see that the collapse of the Golden Horde was not a single dramatic explosion, but a process accelerated by the disciplined silence of the North. Algirdas taught the world a lesson that remains relevant in the 21st century. Empires are rarely destroyed solely from the outside. They rot from within, consumed by corruption and division. The external force, in this case the Lithuanian army, merely kicks down the door that is already unhinged. The Wolf of the North stands atop the hill of history, looking down at an empire that spans horizons, proving that in the Game of Thrones, silence and discipline are deadlier than noise and fury. History is not just about the loudest battles. It's about the ones that actually change the map. So, what is the ultimate lesson from the banks of the Blue Waters? It is that history does not always belong to the biggest army or the loudest empire. It belongs to those who adapt. Algirdas didn't just win a battle. He built a bridge between two worlds, pagan and Christian, east and west, proving that tolerance can be a sharper weapon than terror. But this makes me wonder, if a victory this massive can be buried by the sands of time, what else are we missing? How many other blue waters are out there, waiting to be rediscovered? I want to hear from you. Do you think the Grand Duchy of Lithuania gets enough credit in European history? Or is it destined to remain in the shadow of its larger neighbors? And if you could rewrite one historical narrative, which one would it be? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed uncovering this lost chapter of the Middle Ages, consider hitting that like button and sharing this video with a fellow history lover. It helps us keep the campfire burning. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past. Until next time.